Very few things have been true for almost all human history since the first human settlements. One of them is that sexual assault happens in war and in peace. The other, and thankfully, this is starting to change in many parts of the world, is that most assaults remain unreported, sometimes for years, sometimes forever. This is true for female victims and male victims as well, who have to deal with the same trauma, but often in a much different way. Today, we are going to tell you about the horrific event, the Marocchinate, or the deeds of the Moroccans. Those deeds were rape and murder on a mass scale, mostly rape. What might even be more shocking for people is that the Moroccans were part of the Allied armies moving up the Italian Peninsula in 1944. In the spring of 1944, hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers were slowly advancing up the Italian Peninsula toward Rome. In September 1943, the Allies crossed the Straits of Messina from recently conquered Sicily to mainland Italy. In the far south of the country, it was mostly British and British Imperial troops doing the fighting. To the north, mainly American forces landed at Salerno, some 140 miles south of Rome. The intention was to catch German troops in a trap from north and south, forcing their surrender. Another aspect of the plan was to capture Rome, one of the capital cities of the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo axis, an enemy the Allies had been fighting since 1939. Shortly after the Allied landings in their country, the king and the politicians around him made secret overtures to the Allies. They would overthrow and detain Mussolini and make peace in the hope of sparing their country the destruction they knew would come. That's exactly what happened. Mussolini was taken to a deserted hotel in the mountains, and King Victor Emmanuel III and his closest advisor, Marshal Pietro Badoglio, formed a new government. Unfortunately, Hitler had other plans, and his armies reacted far more quickly to the news of Mussolini's overthrow than the Allies. The Germans already had between 5 and 8 divisions in southern Italy, perhaps 50,000 men. Within a very short time, they added more than 250,000 more, stripping some badly needed troops off the Eastern Front to face the Allied threat closer to home. Hitler also ordered the famously successful commando operation to rescue Mussolini from his captors. For years, the Italians had been a German ally, and though there was no real love lost on either side by 1944, for the most part, the Germans in Italy had behaved. Not after Mussolini's overthrow. Between September 15th to the 26th, the troops of the Acqui Division refused German orders to disarm, engaged German forces in an almost 2-week battle that ended only when the Italians ran out of ammunition, surrendered, and were systematically massacred by German army troops. 5,155 men were executed. 3,000 survivors were herded into transport ships for forced labor in occupied Europe. And most of the ships were sunk by Allied pilots who did not know what was in the unmarked vessels. A further 1,300 troops had been killed in action. In March 1944, German soldiers took revenge for the killing of 33 of their comrades by Italian partisans and slaughtered over 300 people, many of them Jews or political prisoners. In late September and early October 1944, the Germans killed over 700 civilians, including 100 children in the town of Marzabotto. At Sant'Anna di Stazzema, in Tuscany in August of 1944, Waffen-SS troops along with Italian fascist paramilitary units killed over 500 people, including 130 children, the youngest not yet 2 years old. Countless other smaller atrocities took place throughout the country. That's one reason why, despite the destruction of war all around them, most Italians welcomed the arrivals of the Allies in their villages and towns. They figured the worst was over but didn't know what fate had in store for them. Despite the large numbers of American and British Canadian troops in the country, the Italian campaign was a truly Allied effort. Men from Poland, New Zealand, South Africa, India, Brazil, and Greece fought in Italy, as over 100,000 men of the Free French Army. Among the French troops were a sizable contingent of North African soldiers. Before World War II, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia were French possessions. There were also sizable contingents of soldiers from the French sub-Saharan colonies of Gabon, Chad, Central African Republic, Congo-Brazzaville, and the southern part of Cameroon. When France and Britain declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, there were about 75,000 African troops in France. Most of the men in French uniform were kept home for police duties, freeing up French soldiers in those territories to defend the homeland. After the French surrender, most of France's North African colonies were occupied by the Germans and Italians. But by May 1943, the Germans had been driven out of Africa by the Allies' Operation Torch invasion of North Africa on November 8, 1942, and simultaneous British attacks from Egypt. As the Allies liberated North Africa, the Free French forces gathered the North African units for further training and recruited many more men. About 75,000 men from North Africa went to Italy either in the initial landings or shortly afterward. Most of them were trained and organized into formal military units under French officers, but a sizable minority were not. History remembers these men as the Goumiers. There were Algerians, Moroccans, and Tunisians, countries that today are considered Arab. They speak forms of Arabic, Right Arabic, and are overwhelmingly Muslim. However, among the North African troops, an outsized percentage were Berbers. The Berbers are the indigenous people of Northwest Africa, having lived there far longer than the Arabs who arrived in the mid to late 7th and early 8th centuries, bringing the new religion of Islam. Today, being Berber, or at least counted as Berber by the government, is difficult because of urbanization and intermingling in these countries. Berber traditions, customs, and language differ from region to region. Still, it's estimated that half or over half of Morocco today is Berber, between 15 to 40% of Algeria, and about 10% of the population of Tunisia. Most Berbers are Muslim, though there are Berber Christians and a small number of Berber Jews. The culture also includes long age-old traditions that bear some similarities to the belief systems of tribal people around the world. There is also a long military tradition, or maybe martial tradition is a better way to say it. For centuries, the Berbers have defeated, outlasted, or resisted countless invaders from the Carthaginians, who were Phoenician people, and Romans forward. Most Berber tribes lived away from the coasts, in the hills, mountains, and deserts island. Survival in North Africa is difficult. Add to that almost relentless warfare or clan feuds, and you have one tough people. They were also a wild people with a reputation as hard, nearly fearless fighters whose weapon of choice was a blade, sometimes their traditional kumya curved dagger. Berber troops were especially known for their skill in the mountains and the ability to infiltrate seemingly impenetrable enemy positions, leaving slit throats and worse in their wake. In World War II, German soldiers on watch at night in places where there were known to be Berber troops were either extra alert, incredibly frightened, or dead. The sight of slit throats and beheadings for the morning watch was enough to spread near panic and demoralization, especially among rearguard troops. There were Berbers and others in the uniformed Free French Army. They were under the command of many more French officers per unit than the irregular Berber troops called Goumiers, and were generally behaved better. The term Goumier comes from the word koum, which evolved from two branches of Arabic, meaning tribe or people. The French word Goumier means one of a tribe, and has been used since Berbers were recruited for the French army in the early 1900s. A koum or goum was akin to the US military company, with about 200 to 300 men. A Goumier was a man who was part of a goum. In turn, there were 3 or 4 gooms in a tabor, a Turkish word held over for the time of Ottoman rule, similar to a battalion in size. 3 tabors was an engine or group, French words. A tabor was often a relatively independent unit, meaning it was rare for more than a tabor to work together in concert. Rather, they were usually scattered on different areas for the front lines, and even if they were close to one another, they were generally posted in mountainous parts of Italy, where radio reception was spotty at best. In the late stages of the brutality-fought Battle of Monte Cassino, the Goumiers were crucial in putting pressure on German flanks in the mountains, keeping troops there too busy to reinforce where they were more urgently needed, and for guiding other French and Allied troops through the rugged landscape, especially at night. The Gooms and the entire French Expeditionary Corps fell under the overall command of French General Alphonse Juin, who had been in command of Moroccan troops before World War I and who knew more than any other European about the Berbers and Gomiers. Also knew that part of their martial tradition was the taking of war booty. It had to be said of sexual assault and victory, whether it was a foreign foe or another clan. Juin is quoted as telling the Gomiers of the 1st, 3rd, and 4th Tabors that for 50 hours, you will be the absolute masters of what you will find beyond the enemy. Nobody will punish you for what you will do. Nobody will ask you about what you will get up to. Though there is no proof that Juin actually said this, many believe that if Juin did not give the Gomiers something after the key role they played in opening the road to Rome, the Gooms might either revolt or mutiny, and that was something that Juin and the other French commanders could not afford, especially at a juncture where the leadership of the Free French was still being decided. Rome is in the region known to the Romans as Latium, the land of the Latins. Today and during World War II, it's called Lazio. Most of the Gom units in the region were stationed in the area to the south of the city, largely in the hills, where villages may be very near each other as the crow flies but could be hours away on foot, horseback, wagon, and even jeeps. Radio contact from village to village was also spotty, and that would further isolate the victims from what happened next. In other words, even the few Gomiers or their French commanders who might have reported the crimes we're going to tell you about couldn't. From May 19, 1944, the day after the German surrender at Monte Cassino, and for the better part of a week, the Gomiers in southern Lazio went berserk. Throughout the southern part of the area, units of Gomiers, sometimes joined by regular units of North African troops of the French army, went through small towns and villages looking for women, girls, boys, and sometimes men. Many of the men still in the villages were elderly. Many of them, along with any young men found, were shot, had their throats cut, and more. This was often done in plain sight and often in front of their family. One of the men who tried to stop the assault on the people of his town was Don Alberto Turilli of the village Santa Maria di Esperia. Don Alberto had hidden some women in his church, but he himself was discovered and raped in the town square for hours. His injuries, including those from the beating he received as well as the sexual assault, caused his death a few days later. In another town, Father Enrico Giannoni was shot when he tried to prevent a mass assault on local women and girls. The horrors are endless. Many, if not most, people were not victimized just once. Older women, mothers, and young girls were set upon, sometimes by groups as large as 200 or more. Many of these women and girls died as a result. Some later took their own lives. Many victims of the Marocchinate, both male and female, were infected with venereal diseases that the Gooms had picked up in other towns, whether in a legal brothel or through rape. Before and after the Marocchinate, Gomiers committed mass rape. They did it in northern Italy, and they did it again in Germany. After the landings in Normandy and shortly thereafter in southern France, Gomiers committed sexual atrocities in France itself, though on a far smaller scale. But the assaults in the Lazio region were the worst, insofar as numbers are concerned. After the war, there were a number of trials and hearings about the Marocchinate. You are about to hear the testimony from a post-war Italian government panel. Despite the passage of time, we are not including names, though they are on the public record. Instead, we will use initials. This is just a fragment of the record. It's estimated that well over 3,000 rapes took place during the Marocchinate in Lazio, likely far more, for many victims were killed or understandably refused to talk about their horrific experiences. E.R., about 50 years old, is slaughtered by Moroccans because she tried to defend her two daughters, respectively 17 and 18 years old. The mother dies and the daughters are raped. M.M., 55 years old, also tried to save her daughter Maria, who was 21. She was killed with 5 gunshots to the stomach. LM died on May 26, 1944 in the Lasano district while trying to defend the honor of his wife LA and his 4 daughters. One young woman's ordeal ended when Canadian troops arrived in her town, causing the Gooms to flee. The Gooms could have killed us. Valentina's daughter, they killed her. She was 17. She was very beautiful and she was raped by 40 soldiers. When her mother intervened, they cut out her tongue and made her watch. In 2015, one woman who was just 15 when the Gooms arrived and avoided assault by hiding gave this account. Not everyone was as lucky as me. I don't know how many girls were caught, but when the soldiers left, many had venereal diseases. Some became pregnant. Fiancés rejected their fiancés. There were even young women who went crazy and committed suicide. Nobody really talked about it. It stayed in the family. The victims went to the doctor secretly and the girls were given plans to abort. It was a terrible period. It was as if they had killed the joy of youth. Everyone became sad, depressed. A British officer in the casino area recorded his findings as well. Recently, all females in the villages of Patricia, Pofi, Isoleta, Supino, and Morallo were violated. In Lanola, which fell to the Allies on May 21st, 50 women were raped. But as these were not enough to go around, children and even old men were violated. It is reported to be normal for 2 Moroccans to assault a woman simultaneously, one having normal intercourse while the other commits sodomy. In many cases, severe damage to the genitals, rectum, and uterus had been caused. In Castro di Volsci, doctors treated 300 victims of rape, and at Salerno, the British had been forced to build a guarded camp to protect the Italian women. 9 months after the Marocchinate, in just the town of Veroli, over 400 babies were given to the town orphanage. No one is sure how many children were born out of this horror, but many women in a deeply Catholic country where the word abortion was almost never even spoken had their pregnancies ended. Some through risky surgery, others from mixtures of plants known as far back as ancient Rome. Dozens likely died from badly performed operations or post-op infections from procedures carried out in barns, basements, and woods. Many others infected by the Gooms then passed on the disease to their husbands. A massive outbreak of venereal disease occurred. Many women in poor areas were never cured. For those left relatively unscathed, the emotional and psychological trauma associated with sexual assault remained for life, affecting marriages and other relationships. Many women were not able to have children after the events of the Marocchinate. Like the comfort women forced by the Japanese to serve their soldiers in the Pacific, many victims could not be around groups of men, never married, and never had children. When you read or hear accounts of the Marocchinate, one constant thread is the lack of action of the French officers who were supposedly in command of the Gooms. In his book about the events of the Marocchinate, Barris Tommaso writes, French officers did not respond to any solicitation from the victims and watched impassively at the work of their men. As the testimonies report, when civilians showed up to report the violence, the officers shrugged their shoulders and dismissed them with a smirk. Does that mean that the French military did nothing? No, but they could have done far more. 28 Gooms were caught in the act and shot. 3 were later executed by firing squad after a court-martial. 207 men were arrested. 168 served prison sentences. In 1947, the French government acknowledged the deeds of their troops, and compensation was calculated. Except the French never paid. The Italian government, as part of their debt for having invaded southern France in 1940 and siding with Hitler, ended up paying what the French should have paid. Those reparations payments amounted to very little. For years afterward, the French government and the French people preferred to duck their heads in the sand and ignore the Marocchinate. In 1960, however, many French people, some of whom were only kids when World War II ended, knew that Italian star Sophia Loren won the Best Actress Oscar for her role as a protective mother in Two Women, La Ciocchiaria in Italian. Only in the last 10 years or so had there been talk in France about what happened and what the French government could do for the few survivors still living.